Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the HarperCollins World Book Day Marathon. All day today, we have our brilliant authors taking over our social media handles where they talk about ideas that inspire them and the books that they have loved and written. We kickstart the day with India's foremost mythologist and best-selling author Devdutt Pattanaik, who joins us today to give the keynote address. Many of you are already familiar with his critically acclaimed work, such as Yoga, Dharma, Arth, Kam, Moksha, and of course, Bahubali. Today, he joins us to talk to us about his wide ranging oeuvre, and he also attempts to debunk historical myth with historical evidence.
Namaste everyone. My name is Devdutt Pattanaik and I write on mythology. And today is World's Book Day, and it's an important day for writers like me. I have been writing for the last 25 years, and moments like this helps me think about how much impact books have had on my life. Today, I would like to talk to you a little bit about books, of course, the writing process, how I create these books. I have written 50 books over the last 25 years. But along the line, I want to take you on a journey, on an idea which is occupying my mind nowadays, the idea of violence and non-violence, and how I used writing of books to decode a very complex idea like violence. So if you hang on, you will hear me talk about books, writing processes, and of course, uh, how I have understood violence through the writing process. And that's what we will do. That's the journey that we will go on. So I started writing about 25 years ago. I think I was in my 20s. Around 1995 is when I wrote my first book called Shiva: An Introduction. I've always been interested in writing and communicating. I was trained in medicine, and I worked in the magazine of the Grand Medical College magazine. And we had this college magazine, and I was very interested in getting the articles together, editing them, getting them printed. And I still have some of those old copies. So I think writing was something that I always enjoyed. And reading as a student, the medical students, you're surrounded by books, textbooks really. But I was also interested in other topics, especially around culture and eventually mythology. And that's how my interest began. But writing this book, on Shiva, exposed me very systematically to the idea of mythology. I wrote this book on Shiva, after which I wrote a book on Vishnu, an introduction. And this was 25 years ago. Devi, an introduction. And gradually I started writing more and more books for different publishers. It became even more detailed. And I brought my scientific training to the study of mythology because I realized that there weren't many books that extolled me information about Shiva, just simple information. What are the symbols of Shiva? What are the rituals of Shiva? What are the stories of Shiva? What are the festivals of Shiva? Or for that matter, Vishnu or Devi. And as I started writing these books over time, I realized that when I wrote the book on Vishnu, I realized I understood Shiva better. When I wrote the book on the goddess, I understood the gods better. And I realized something called comparison. When you compare and contrast abstract things, you understand them better. This is very different from science, where you use a lot of measurement and mathematics. What is high blood pressure? What is low blood pressure? What is fat? What is thin? What is, how do you measure the body? How do you measure the heart rate? How do you measure respiration? That's what I was taught, and it was always number based. But you cannot apply that when you are studying the gods. You can't apply numbers to Shiva or a Vishnu or a Devi, but you can compare and contrast them. For example, when I read the book on Vishnu in order to write my book Vishnu: An Introduction, I suddenly realized when describing Vishnu, there was always this idea that he is very well dressed. He wears silk robes, bright silk robes which are yellow in color, and his body is smeared with sandal paste and musk, and he wears flowers and he wears pearls. He's suddenly you have a very different form appearing in front of you as compared to Shiva, who wears animal hide and is covered with ash. And when I saw the contrast between these two gods, and I realized, hey, Shiva looks so different from Vishnu. Why are they different? What is the secret of this difference? And as I started studying the secret of the difference, I understood the gods better. I realized in a Shiva temple they give raw unboiled milk, but in a Krishna temple or a Vishnu temple they would offer butter, which is prepared by churning curds. So raw milk given to Shiva, milk turned into curds, turned into butter, and then turned into ghee, and then offered to Vishnu. And you realize this, the communication from Shiva is different from the communication from Vishnu. Then you learn about the goddess, and then you realize the goddess is so different. You have the wild goddess Kali, the domesticated goddess Gauri, both linked to Shiva. But when it comes to Vishnu, you have a different goddess Lakshmi. She's sometimes the earth, Bhudevi, who's complaining that she's being ill-treated by kings who abuse their power and plunder her resources. Or there is Sri Devi, who's churned out of the ocean of milk, a whimsical goddess of wealth. And you suddenly realize that with Shiva, the goddess is different. With Vishnu, the goddess is different. She's manifesting differently. And I said, what are they trying to communicate? And this happened because when you write, you have to think deeply as to why you are using certain words, certain ideas. You're not writing randomly. This is not fiction writing. This was non-fiction writing written for an audience that is interested in knowing and decoding the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Shiva, the Vishnu stories. And that is what I started to write. I wanted to write as if I was reading those books. My curiosity led me to do research, which led me to write the book. And I was writing the book in such a way that others who did not have the time to do research could read my book and enjoy quickly all the things that took me a lot of time to figure out. So when people tell me, Dev, that we want to write, I always tell people, please ask, why are you writing? Are you writing a book because you want to write? Or are you writing because this is a book that people want to read? Unless you focus on people in front of you and figure out why they want to read, you'll never be a good writer. And for me, this was a very important thing because I always enjoyed communication. Whether it was giving a lecture, whether it was writing a novel, whether it was writing an essay, I enjoyed the process of communication. I was never trained in it, but I enjoyed the idea of sharing an idea with people and seeing the aha in their eyes. And I wanted to do that with Shiva and Vishnu. And I started writing books for that. I have written 50 books in 25 years. It requires a lot of discipline. And I work very hard in deciding what is it that I want to communicate with people. What should the title be? What should be the summary be? I always begin with the title. Then I begin with the summary. Then I write the summary or the blurb of the book. And then I will write the table of content to understand how will I expand this idea. Then I'll write the subheadings, and only then I will start writing the book. So it takes a lot of time. You know the whole before you know the parts. Of course, it's never fully sure when you start writing where it is going to go. Lots of changes happen. Editing plays a very important role. Almost 50% of writing is editing. And then, of course, you have to go back and forth. I illustrate my books, so I have to illustrate the ideas exactly like, for me, they were like science diagrams. You draw a science diagram to explain a concept in a science textbook. Same way, I would draw a Shiva or a Vishnu, a Trishula. How is a Trishula different from a Sudarshan Chakra? I would ask these questions. And I ask these questions, I would answer these questions, write them down in a simple way using bullet points, using flow charts so that the audience understands. And that's how the book would emerge. And recently, I have been interested by the idea of violence and non-violence. And I've been paying a lot of attention to this, the idea of ahimsa. And I noticed two groups of people around me. There were the vegetarians who believed they were non-violent, so ahimsa. And then there were the Gandhians who talked about Gandhi's non-cooperative ahimsa satyagraha. And I started thinking about this and I said, let me write about these ideas, because I was also working on a book on Jainism. You see, after I have written books on Hinduism, which was my primary interest, I realized that to understand Hinduism, you need to understand Buddhism and Jainism. Just as you cannot understand Shiva without Vishnu and the gods without the goddess, you cannot understand Hinduism without understanding Buddhism and Jainism. And all of them, I said, what is common in all of them? They all deal with rebirth. And then you realize, wait, which cultures don't talk about rebirth? And I realized, the Greek mythology doesn't talk about rebirth. Egyptian mythology doesn't talk about rebirth. The Bible doesn't talk about rebirth. Christianity, Islam, Judaism does not have rebirth. And that is how my theory of mythology emerged. And I realized that the idea of non-violence is very important in India. It's a very, very important idea. For example, in the Vedas, you realize there were some people who did Pashu Bali. That means they sacrificed animals, different kinds of animals. Let's not get into controversy which animals, but they would sacrifice animals, a Pashu Medha Yajna. But the interesting thing was, if in the early days they would slaughter the animal in the ritual precinct, in the later days, they would take the animal away from the ritual precinct and not slaughter it, but they would suffocate it so that it would not make too much sound and there would be no blood that would pollute the ritual precinct, which means they did not stop the violence, but they did not want to witness the violence and they did not want to be polluted by the violence. And I found that very fascinating. And this was very different from the people who spoke of vegetarian non-violence and people who spoke of political non-violence as a non-cooperation movement that Gandhi spoke of. Nowadays, a lot of young people think that violence is the answer to life's problems. Violence makes us valorous and proud. We should be valorous like the Rajputs and the Marathas and the kings who fought in battles. That is the way India should have defeated the British. And Gandhi's method was perhaps a very feminine, passive, subservient approach. And there are these schools of thought. Everybody's entitled to their opinions. Some people believe in violence. Some people don't believe in violence. Some people believe in corporal punishment for the children. Spare the rod and spoil the child, they say. And they believe the children should be beaten into submission. But nowadays, education will say that beating the child is unacceptable. In fact, if a teacher raises his or her hand, she could be arrested. So, is violence necessary for child rearing? You will have different schools of thought. Marital violence between husband and wife, is that acceptable? If it is not acceptable for children, if it is not acceptable for women, why is it acceptable in a political arena? Right now around the world, there are people fighting these terrible wars, killing each other. There are terrorists who are saying we are doing it for justice. And then there are nation states which are saying we're doing it for self-defense. And they're finding elaborate arguments for violence. Meanwhile, you have Gandhi who chooses non-violence, and there are points on either side. How long should you keep quiet? When do you explode into violence? So violence is a very important topic in a political, social arena, but it is also an important topic when you're dealing with food. When I'm eating food, the act of consumption, when I'm eating, should I kill an animal and eat it? Is it murdering a goat or a buffalo or a chicken or a fish, acceptable and to eat it. And this becomes an important conversation. We are told many monastic orders refuse to eat animal food. Many people believe that Buddha was non-violent, and yet when violence erupted in Sri Lanka and Burma and they saw Buddhist monks participating in violence, people were quite shocked by this sight because they assumed Buddhism is a passive religion. Jainism believes in non-violence very strongly, does not like confrontation. The Jain gurus did not like debates, and they always withdrew from debates, saying that's not wisdom. But you do see increasingly a large, vociferous group of young Jains feeling that they are being pushed around and they need to fight back. And even if they don't physically fight back, they outsource violence to other groups of people. Is outsourcing violence non-violence? Is a question to be asked. So that's another form of violence. And that is what led me to this conversation of violence. And I realized that when you read the Ramayana and Mahabharata, Ram is raising a bow and Krishna is raising the Sudarshan Chakra, and he's a wrestler who kills Chanura and Mushtika, and the gods of Hinduism are violent. Vishnu takes the form of a wild boar and fights demons and raises the earth from the bottom of the sea. Shiva raises his trident and impales Andhaka. Or Kamadeva is burnt alive. So violence is very much part of Hindu literature. And so when you're reading the books, you wonder, is violence a good thing or a bad thing? Gods are participating in violence. Should we participate in violence? When you read the Bible, the Old Testament, the God is demanding people to submit to his authority, and if people do not obey the laws of God, he sends down fire and brimstone. And there are stories of great violence when Abraham has to move to Egypt, stories of Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. That's violence, the murder of one brother of the other. Then you have stories of violence in Canaan as the Holy Land is being established, violence of David, violence of Solomon. These are the Old Testament stories of great violence, and the temple being broken by the Assyrians. And then you come to the New Testament and you hear of Jesus Christ, who doesn't really subscribe to violence and who talks about love, and it's a new idea. And yet in the New Testament, the last section has the book of Revelation, which talks about taking up weapons against the devil in the final battle of the apocalypse. And again, you have violence appearing even in the New Testament. So Jesus talks about love, and suddenly you have a new kind of messianic idea, the book of Revelations, which talks about violence. So you find violence everywhere. Islamic story is full of violence. The Prophet is driven out of the city of Mecca. He goes and takes refuge in Medina. He fights back to get back his old city, and he establishes Islam. And later, 2 generations later, his family is slaughtered in Karbala. And this is a story which is found in Islamic law. So violence seems to be there everywhere when you read. And I'm asking myself, where's the first time that people spoke of non-violence? And I started thinking about it. And why would a religion like Jainism talk about non-violence? And what did they mean by non-violence? What is the philosophy of non-violence? Does it mean at a political arena, a social arena, at a personal arena? Is violence a metaphysical idea? And this, when you start systematically thinking from a scientific point of view and to go very, very logically, you start asking yourself 3 questions. Is there violence in nature? Why is there violence in nature? How does it manifest in nature? So you always begin with nature, Prakriti. Then you say, what about violence in culture? How does violence happen in culture? Why is there violence in culture? How does it manifest itself? And then you ask, why would some cultures talk about non-violence in different ways? Sometimes don't hurt humans. Sometimes it is about eat food which involves less violence or no violence. And then it talks about physical violence, psychological violence, So you realize violence is a very big topic to explore. And if you read my books, you will notice I talk a lot about violence. I talk about violence in the Ramayana, in the Mahabharata, when I talk of nature, when I talk of culture, when I talk of Shiva, when I talk of Vishnu, when I talk of Durga, when I talk of Buddha. You know, when Buddha becomes, the Mahayana Buddhism comes, you see Buddha is associated with a character called Vajrapani, who holds in his hand a Vajra. And in the Tibetan Buddhism, you have these bodhisattvas and fierce forms of Buddha like Heruka, who have weapons in his hands and is decorated with the human heads. There is a Mahasiddhas who are associated with bones and they have weapons in their hands, very different from the passive Buddha. And then you have the Jain gods, the Jain Tirthankaras, who look so calm and composed. And next to them is the Yaksha and the Yakshini. And the Yaksha and the Yakshinis are holding weapons in their hands and they're protecting the Tirthankara. And the Yakshas and the Yakshinis were very popular in the state of Karnataka and they were worshipped and they have weapons in their hands. And you think about it and then all this makes you wonder. And that is when you start thinking about violence in different ways. And so let me take you on a journey. You know, I do all this when I'm writing a book on Mahimsa, when I'm writing a book on Jainism. I will read the history of it, the geography of it, the philosophies, the stories, the symbols, the rituals. I don't accept what is just written. I try to read between the lines. This is the way I was taught medicine. And I would then systematically put it in a book. I would, as I said, I will work on the table of content. Which idea should I present first? Which idea should I present second? How should I explain it to my audience which may not be familiar with the books that I'm reading? It's a challenge. But let's try and understand violence a little bit. Let's look at natural violence, nature's violence. Why is there violence in nature? If there were no living organisms, would there be violence? You know, planets crash against each other, rocks clash against each other, water can split a rock, fire can burst out because of a thunderstorm, burning forests. So is that violence when it involves inanimate objects, you know, rocks and water and wind and fire? Or is violence there only when we're dealing with animate, living creatures? And then you realize when we use the word violence, we're really talking about living organisms. And you see violence everywhere because violence happens for two reasons. The first reason is because the living organism wants to eat something. So in order to survive, it has to eat food. So the predator goes after the prey. The herbivorous animals is violent towards plants. The carnivorous animal is violent towards animals. It consumes the animal. There is a violence which is involved in the act of consumption. The second type of violence is a violence where you protect yourself from being consumed. So you realize that, you know, all herbivorous animals have been given horns so they can fight back and protect themselves from predators. Then you look at plants and you realize plants have thorns. And why do they have thorns? To protect themselves from herbivorous animals, which means plants do not wish to die. They are protecting themselves from violence of those who wish to consume them. No plant wants to die, otherwise it would not have thorns. So now when you're eating a plant, does it mean you have violently attacked the plant for your own survival? So does the act of eating a plant violent or non-violent? Does it matter whether it feels pain or not? It doesn't want to die. That is why plants have defense mechanisms. No living organism wants to die. No plant says, come and kill me. But we do kill plants. Without cutting a tree, we would not get a log of wood. All the wood in your house is technically dead body of plants. And you realize that violence is necessary for life. In order to survive, every plant, every animal, and every human being is killing something. In fact, culture is based on killing of nature. So nature is domesticated and you cultivate it to suit your needs, and the whole process is violent. So nature becomes culture through violence. And you realize the violence of nature is very different from the violence of culture, because in nature there is a give and take of violence. Every animal that eats gets eaten. Every animal produces babies so that other animals can eat the baby. That is why you reproduce. If the deer did not reproduce more deer, the next generation of tigers will have no food. So you realize the deer is not only being eaten by the tiger, the deer is producing deers so that the tigers can continue eating the deer. However, the deer also has been given horns and speed to protect itself from being eaten, and therefore there is this tension between the eater and the eaten in nature, and this violence of nature is visualized in mythology as the goddess Kali. And then the goddess Kali, then you have cultural violence, which is created by humans, because humans say only we must survive. We think we are superior to plants and animals, so we burn forests, we domesticate animals and create a space for ourselves, which we call culture, which in mythology is called the goddess Gauri. So you look how mythology emerges from nature, Kali and Gauri, and the transformation of Kali into Gauri is enabled by Brahma, the creator. But where did Brahma come from? He came from nature. So is Brahma the father of the goddess or the son of the goddess? And the mythology creates these wonderful paradoxical ideas, and they'll say, well, Brahma is the son of Kali, but the father of Gauri. So human beings are children of nature, and we are the parents of culture. And when we enjoy cultures, we are effectively having a relationship with that what we have created. This creates all those stories of incest that people get very uncomfortable with. But then there is other forms of cultural violence. In nature, animals compete with each other over territory. Plants compete with each other over sunlight and nutrients. Humans compete over property. We compete over women and cattle. We treat women like cattle. We fight over women. We fight over cattle. We fight over land. We fight over territory. Nowadays we are fighting elections. We enjoy fighting. And we fight because we want to win and be triumphant and control and dominate everyone else. And of course we want to justify our violence by saying we are fighting for the forces of good, or we are fighting for justice, or we are fighting for truth, and therefore we have lovely stories to justify social and political violence. So we have violence against nature, we have violence against fellow human beings as we try to domesticate them to align with our worldview. And that's what we see around us. The debates, the arguments, the violence of the state, the violence of terrorists, all trying to control humans. And that's another form of violence. And in response to that, we have the concept of ahimsa, which says it all starts with consumption. So if I consume less, I will be less violent with nature. And if I consume less and I hoard less, I will have less violence with other human beings. These ideas emerged in India. When did they emerge? Some people say it comes from Jainism, some people say from Buddhism. But I have traced some of these ideas to the Harappan civilization. In the Harappan civilization, there are images of women separating men from fighting. I call it the ahimsa seal. And it is found, and you find these women with bangles stopping men from fighting and saying, don't fight. Could this be the origin of ahimsa? Or was it the origin of ahimsa, the idea from Jains or from Buddhists? These are questions I love to ponder about. And what is non-violence? Is it physical or is it psychological? Can we violate people without spilling a single drop of blood? Practices like untouchability, homophobia, where you reject people for their sexual orientation or because they're born in a particular family or for their gender, or the way we treat fellow human beings with disrespect, insulting them, abusing them. If I insult you, if I abuse you, I am being psychologically violent. Is that ahimsa? Can I be a vegetarian and insult you and say I'm non-violent? Can I be a vegetarian and a soldier but say that I'm non-violent? Or if a person eats meat and fish but does not hit his wife or his children and does not kill anyone and doesn't insult anyone and treats everyone respectfully, is he non-violent? These are the questions that we explore. And when we explore, writers like me think about it, write about it, tell stories about it, and we make books which we hope people like you will read and explore these ideas, because through books you get access to my mind. And when you get access to my mind, you see how I think, how I feel, and maybe it expands your thoughts, your own ideas. I try very hard not to convince you of an idea, but to expand your thinking process, make you look at the world differently, share frameworks, share new ways of explaining so that you understand how it happens. And that is what I try to do. I've been trying very hard to explain to people concepts of mythology, concepts of culture, Indian and world mythology, and within that, the idea of violence and non-violence. You can not eat without violence, and therefore the idea of killing in order to get food gives rise to the two most powerful ideas in India. When you feed someone, it is dharma. But because you kill someone to create food to feed someone, it is dharma sankat. So while ahimsa may sound like dharma, the act of production of food, the violence associated with the production of food creates dharma sankat. And I hope you think about dharma, dharma sankat, himsa, ahimsa. And as you read books, mine and other people's books on this World Book Day, you understand how much thought goes into telling a simple story. Namaste.